quoting the Bible. A court in Finland offers a significant ruling in favor of religious freedom. We have reaction from a lawyer involved in the case. Immigration crisis. Why the Biden administration is doing away with the Trump-era regulation regarding the U.S. southern border. Kitchen table troubles. Evaluating why inflation, job numbers, and rising interest rates could signal jitters for the U.S. economy. And male and female. We examine implications from cultural and legal efforts to redefine gender. On EWTN News Nightly for Thursday, March 31st, 2022. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. I'm Tracy Sable. Reaction continues to pour in following a major court verdict in favor of religious freedom and free speech. A court in Finland yesterday upheld the right to free speech. It dismissed all charges against a former member of the country's parliament who had been charged with hate speech for sharing her views on marriage and sexual ethics. Lutheran bishop also was cleared. Joining us now is Lorcan Price, International Legal Counsel for Alliance Defending Freedom, who was involved in this case. Lorcan, great to see you. Thank you for your time. Talk to us a little bit more about this ruling and the importance of it.
Thank you, Tracy. This is an important case, both for Christians in Finland, obviously, but also more widely around Europe, because it illustrates, I think, very clearly the dangers associated with these hate speech laws that we're seeing across Europe at the moment. And it shows in a very pointed way the fact that they can be used to stifle the freedom of religion and the freedom of expression of Christians when they're engaged in making statements publicly to others, and when they're engaged in writing about Christian beliefs, and when they're engaged in using social media. So for us, the fact that two very high-profile Lutheran Christians in Finland would be investigated by the police, charged, and then brought to 2 days of court hearings for expressing what are mainstream Christian beliefs about sexuality and marriage was really quite outrageous. And this case should never have made it to trial. Obviously, we're very happy and relieved, and as are our clients, that the charges were dismissed. But I'm afraid to say that we may not be out of the woods yet. Both Päivi Räsänen and Bishop Johanna may now face an additional round of court proceedings if the prosecutors decide to appeal, and we'll know that within the next week.
Can you talk to us a little bit more about that and what that would mean for them?
Well, what it means is more disruption and stress in their lives, having to deal with more court proceedings, with more attention on this case, and just generally the problems associated with being dragged into court. Anyone who's been through any kind of court process knows that it's not something that's easy at the best of times. In this case, there was a huge amount of publicity, both domestically in Finland and internationally, on this case. And everything Päivi and Bishop Johanna have said and written about over the last number of decades has been gone through with a tooth comb by journalists and by other individuals trying to find some way of suggesting that they are engaged in hate speech or that they have animosity towards certain members of the community, when nothing could be further from the truth. Both of them have been very clear consistently that every human being is made in the image and likeness of God, and they deserve to be respected and cherished. But as Päivi herself said on the steps of the courthouse, what we do is we love the sinner but not the sin. And that's at the heart of what she has been talking about in the course of her writings and her public appearances in over 2.5 decades of public life as a member of Parliament.
Lorcan, I'm curious, how is Päivi doing right now? I mean, how did she feel after the initial ruling came out?
Well, she's very relieved and grateful, and grateful for the prayers and support she's received around the world and from across the all Christian denominations. She's obviously concerned that this could continue. But what she's found remarkable about the whole thing is the number of people who've written to her, people who are not Christians, saying that they admired her courage for taking this stance, and the number of people who have said, as a result of reading about this case, that they've started to look more deeply into what Christians believe about human sexuality and marriage. And that in itself, I think, has given her great strength and comfort in dealing with this ordeal. And Bishop Johanna, the same as well. He has been really impressed by the prayers that he's received from around the world and people as far away as Africa, Asia, South America, and of course in the United States contacting them. I think that's been a very important source of comfort and strength for both of them when they're dealing with hostile media and police interrogations and courtroom cross-examination, to know that there are people around the world that have been supporting and praying for them.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, Lark, we don't have a whole lot of time left, but it doesn't seem that things are just quite over for them yet. But that being said, with the ruling, can you talk to us maybe about how and if this will help people whose religious beliefs are being questioned?
We think it's a very important case for that reason. While it doesn't set, let's say, a new legal precedent outside Finland, it shows that where criminal complaints are made against Christians for speaking about their faith, citing scripture, and talking about marriage and sexuality, that simply because some people may find that upsetting or offensive is not in and of itself a reason for criminal charges to be brought, and is not a crime. So the message from this case, I think we're trying to make it very clear that hate speech laws are harmful, but Christians should not fear that they will inevitably be prosecuted as a result of these kind of laws, and that there are ways to defend themselves, and that we're very happy with the result for that reason. And we hope, if it is appealed by the prosecutor, that we'll be successful in the Court of Appeal.
We'll be praying for all of you. And thank you so much for speaking to us about this very important case. Lorcan Price, International Legal Counsel for Alliance Defending Freedom. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, the Biden administration condemns what it calls the proliferation of dangerous anti-transgender legislative attacks that have been introduced and passed in state legislatures around the country. But conservatives are pushing back. White House correspondent Owen Jensen reports.
Tracy, the White House has sparred with states like Florida over laws that pit gender issues against parental rights. But the Republican governor has been holding his ground. The White House releases a multi-page statement recognizing what it calls Transgender Day of Visibility, reaffirming that transgender children have the right to access gender-affirming health care.
To everyone celebrating Transgender Day of Visibility, I want you to know that your president sees you.
Starting April 11th, the White House says all U.S. citizens will be able to select an X as their gender marker on their U.S. passport application. But groups like the Family Research Council criticize the transgender movement.
It's really disheartening to me because there's a lot of a flurry of activity to affirm dysfunction.
The Biden-Harris administration is also slamming Florida Governor Ron DeSantis over a new law there. But the governor defends the parental rights measure, which prohibits classroom instruction on sexual orientation or gender identity in kindergarten through third grade.
I don't care what Hollywood says. I don't care what big corporations say. Here I stand. I'm not backing down.
Also today, President Biden unveiled more plans to lower sky-high gas prices, including releasing more oil from America's Strategic Petroleum Reserve, 1 million barrels per day. He says Russia's invasion of Ukraine is hurting the global oil supply.
Today, I'm authorizing the release of 1 million barrels per day for the next 6 months, over 180 million barrels.
Now, President Biden also said it's hard to predict, but that a gallon of gas could drop anywhere from 10 to 35 cents a gallon. He added it will take some time. Now, former President Donald Trump very critical of the move, saying that it will be a futile attempt to reduce oil and gasoline prices. At the White House, Owen Jensen, EWTN News Nightly.
And coming up later in our newscast, analysis from Maria Keffler, co-founder of Advocates Protecting Children. Well, the Biden administration is doing away with Trump-era pandemic policies for migrants. Some officials and lawmakers warn without the rule, the U.S. could see a new surge of migrants attempting to cross the border. Capitol Hill correspondent Eric Rosales has that story.
Title 42 has been in place for the last 2 years, allowing Border Patrol to swiftly deport migrants without the opportunity to seek asylum due to COVID concerns. Democrats say even those here illegally should be given every chance.
This administration has led with the perspective, rightfully so, that individuals fleeing have an opportunity to present their case for asylum.
But Republicans warn of health threats.
People coming from around the world across our border, in many instances from hundreds of different countries, many of them, perhaps most of them, aren't vaccinated. They've not tested for COVID-19.
Several memos have been circulating by the Senate Republican Conference, which cites U.S. Border Patrol encounters and puts the blame for these encounters on President Biden and his administration. Latest numbers from U.S. Customs and Border Protection show encounters are increasing each month. More than 154,000 in January to more than 164,000 in February.
They have no plan in place to deal with what is already a disaster, but if the expectations come to fruition when they repeal Title 42, would be a catastrophe in terms of the humanitarian crisis that it would create at our southern border.
Some want to change an asylum policy.
There's a 1.5 million person backlog for dealing with asylum claims. 1.5 million. This means that when you are allowed into the country to await an immigration judge looking at your case, there will be anywhere from 4 to 6 years before your case is considered.
Texas Republican Congressman Chip Roy wrote to his GOP colleagues arguing Congress should remove Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas. Quote, "It is certainly a high crime or misdemeanor for a public officer to purposely endanger Americans while willfully ignoring one's oath to enforce our laws. Title 42 is likely to expire in May, pending a ruling by the Centers for Disease Control." Eric Rosales, EWTN News Nightly.
Coming up, one country's Catholic bishops are concerned about food and fuel shortages. Plus, analysis of the U.S. economy and whether things will become better or worse. President Biden announced today that his administration will release 1 million barrels of oil from the reserves every day for the next 6 months. The move is an effort to help lower high gas prices. The White House says, quote, "This record release will provide a historic amount of supply to serve as bridge until the end of the year when domestic production ramps up." And joining us now to discuss is Paul Daikowitz, editor and columnist at stockinvestor.com. He is also author of Holy Smokes, Golden Guidance from Notre Dame's Championship Chaplain. Paul, welcome. Great to see you. Thanks for coming on. We have a lot to get to. But first, I want to talk about President Biden's plan to release oil from the reserves. What do you think of that, and how much of a help do you think that will be?
I think it could be a little help, especially on the short term. I think the key is to also have other policies to increase production. So it should be a combination of strategies. But that at least is one first step to try to help some people initially in the early stages with all the needed oil that has to go to our allies in Europe and other places due to what's happened in Ukraine.
Yeah, and as you know, President Biden has repeatedly blamed the high gas prices on Russia and the war in Ukraine. That said, how much has Russia's invasion of Ukraine impacted our economy, and in what ways?
I think it's probably been a relatively minor impact so far. I think the sanctions will affect the economy more later on, less so for us than for some other nations. Obviously, those countries in Europe that were expecting to get fuel from Russia and wanted to cut it off as quickly as they could will be affected more. And our job really would be to, as Americans, to try to provide that production that they're going to be missing from the Soviet Union. And there are other, bans on other types of things, natural gas besides just oil and other types of resources. Many companies are pulling out of Russia and not doing business there any longer. And then, of course, there was the SWIFT financial system that was cut off from Russia. So there are a number of sanctions that ideally would help to pressure President Putin to take his troops out of Ukraine and stop the attacks not only on the military there, but many civilians, probably thousands that are estimated to have died. So those are longer term issues economically that also have a humanitarian aspect to them as well, with the deaths and injuries that are taking place, unfortunately.
Yeah, and here at home, a lot of people are concerned about inflation and worried that we may be headed into a recession. From your perspective, do you think that's where things are going here in the United States?
Initially, on the short term, no. I see 4 key risks that we want to be monitoring and that will push down consumption. One, of course, is rising interest rates. That's a big issue. You'll have the Fed promising 6 more increases of the federal funds rate during the course of the year after already recently raising it. So that's one of the source of pressure. They need to do that to control inflation, which has gotten to be to its highest points in the last decade. So inflation is a second item that needs to be controlled, and that could take time to ratchet down with the increased interest rates. A third one is the global crisis with the geopolitical problems, particularly with Russia's attack of Ukraine, and when they make claims about cutting back on bombing, and then they bomb further in the same places they said would cut back. That does not bode well for the peace talks and for this situation to end anytime soon. And of course, you have the humanitarian crisis with 4+ million refugees from Ukraine going to neighboring nations to flee the attacks that have not only targeted military installations but also civilians in residential areas, hospitals, schools, churches. So that's a huge issue going forward. And then, of course, another thing is supply chain issues. That has reduced the amount of product that's available. So you may have increasing dollars available with some of the government funding for people who needed help, but you also have increased demand. And consequently, if you have fewer products, that would raise prices yet, even beyond what we've seen so far. So that's another risk that could slow down the economy. So I view it as more of an economic Lent, as opposed to a recession that we'll be facing, with people needing to reduce consumption, make some sacrifices, just like they do in Lent, but expect it to go well beyond the 40 days of Lent.
Yeah, Paul, we probably have maybe about a minute or left, but I want to ask you, what concerns you the most right now on the financial front, on our economy, and what advice would you give folks who are worried about, where things are going right now?
I would just encourage people to stay calm. So often people can make short-term decisions that seem to be good, temporarily, but then they don't get back in the market if they want to pull out. So I would just sort of stay calm. There are some reasons why things could rebound. I expect some technology stocks to improve, but it's going to be more of a stock pickers situation or an industry by industry, choice, as opposed to just maybe betting on the market as you had been able to do in recent years when we had the largest bull market in history. The other thing to point out to people is just to be careful about doing things that seem like they're too speculative. So things that could do well are commodities, because you could still have increasing demand for products in the things that metal produces, steel, and coal in some other places of the economy that may have been frowned upon earlier. But for now, they look like they're the hot places to be.
Okay. Well, Paul, thank you so much for your expertise. Great to have you on.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Sri Lanka's Catholic bishops are warning about potential consequences from the country's severe economic crisis. Long lines of people wait to buy kerosene oil for cooking. Other basic needs are in short supply, including electricity from the country's power grid. The Catholic Bishops' Conference in Sri Lanka describes conditions as nearing the precipice of a failed state. Tunisia's president has dissolved parliament in a move seen as the latest blow to its young democracy.
وبناء على الفصل الثاني والسبعين.
Kais Saied announced the decision in a televised address yesterday. The country's parliament has not officially convened since last July. Saied has been governing the country by decree ever since. He said that the country faces imminent peril because of protests and economic crisis. Up next, a closer look at how the gender debate is playing out in women's sports. Plus, taking in the final moments from the World's Expo in Dubai. Planned Parenthood is suing the state of Idaho to block its new heartbeat law. Idaho's law is modeled after the Texas law, which the U.S. Supreme Court has allowed to remain in effect despite similar legal challenges. Idaho's law is slated to take effect on April 22nd. Well, Oklahoma and Arizona passed legislation to protect women's sports. The two states join more than a dozen other states with similar laws which prohibit transgender women from competing in women's sports. And joining us now is Maria Keffler, co-founder of Advocates Protecting Children and author of Desist, Detrans, and Detox, Getting Your Child Out of the Gender Cult. Maria, welcome. Thank you so much for coming on. We appreciate it. Let's talk a little bit more about all these states passing laws banning transgender women who are biological males from participating in women's sports. Why do you think this is gaining so much traction?
You know, I think this has been a really strategic effort on the part of trans rights activists to take, they've taken the language captured. I prefer not to call these transgender women because they are men. They are men. And we need to recognize that. We need to recognize that sex is binary, and asking people to play on teams that correspond with their biological sex is not wrong. It's not bigoted. It's not hateful. And when I see headlines like governor, hates trans people, wants to keep them from playing sports, that's not accurate. That's not good reporting. The real story is that boys and men need to play on boys and men's teams to protect women and girls' sports.
Yeah, and there are many states, as you know, as mentioned, are kind of pushing back on that and kind of banning that. I want to get your perspective on that.
On banning girls or boys from playing in girls' sports, is that?
Exactly.
I really just want to emphasize boys and men need to play on their own teams, because once boys and men start playing in women's sports, like we've seen with the UPenn swim team, and I'm going to call him Will Thomas, it takes away those opportunities from women. Men, especially who've been through puberty, have a lot of advantages, physical advantages over women. It is the end of women's sports when men play in women's sports.
Yeah, something that came out just recently, the Washington Post is reporting that the Department of Education is considering enacting new laws under Title IX that would include gender identity. Title IX, as many people know, bars discrimination on the basis of sex in education. That said, if enacted, how significant do you think that would be?
Oh, I think it's incredibly significant. If sex is replaced with gender identity in law, that means sex categories no longer legally exist. There is no such thing as a woman. If anyone can identify as a woman, women's protections will be gone. We're seeing the erosion of our privacy, of our rights. We no longer are able to have those safe single-sex spaces. Gender identity, the definition of that is how one feels about one's gender. Any fifth grader can tell you cannot define a word using the word that you're trying to define. Gender identity is essentially meaningless. It's just how you feel about yourself. And by replacing sex with gender identity under law, we allow any man to identify as a woman, enter women's spaces, and we know that there are predators who take advantage of that. We see that already.
Yeah, we have probably less than a minute left, but I do really want to get your perspective on this. As our own Jensen reported earlier, HHS released a document today advocating for gender-affirming care, including surgeries for young people, adolescents. I want to get your thoughts on that. How do you feel about that?
You know, again, they've captured the language with some of these words that they're using. So-called gender-affirming care, what that means is putting someone in a lifelong path to medicalization. And this is over the way people feel about themselves. In no other area of medicine do we ask someone, how do you feel about yourself? Well, we're going to medicalize you because of that. Those are mental health issues. And when people are put on this path to medicalization, very often they are medical customers for life, whether they detransition, they've stopped making their own hormones and they've got to take synthetic hormones. It's really a disaster for children, and that's what this so-called affirming medical care is.
Yeah, Marie, we had so much more we could talk to you about. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but thank you so much for coming on and giving us your analysis. We appreciate it. Finally tonight, the festivities at Expo 2020 have come to a close in Dubai. Before the lights finally dimmed, the pandemic-delayed event brought in some 24 million visitors over 6 months as participants. The Vatican's pavilion promoted human fraternity through cultural and religious dialogue. With its closing, some of the Expo's national pavilions will remain, while others will comprise a new business district. Well, we thank you for watching tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Tracy Sable. Good night and God bless.